Hello, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm the founder and executive director of the Africa Urban Lab, or AUL. We're a research center and policy lab housed at the African School of Economics, Zanzibar. At the AUL, as the name suggests, we're focused on really rapid urbanization occurring across Africa and how that urbanization can be harnessed for economic growth and structural transformation. As part of this work at the AUL, we run the AUL Working Paper Series, which highlights frontier research on some of the most important and impactful urban policy and growth policy questions facing African cities today. And as part of this working paper series, when we publish a working paper, it's accompanied by a virtual presentation on that paper from the authors, which is why we are here today. Today's paper, it's titled The Impact of Industrial Parks on Local Labor Markets, Evidence from Ethiopia. And for those interested in the paper and reading it, we have a link to it in the video's show notes below, in the description below. Presenting the paper today is one of its authors, Tevin Tefesse. Tevin is a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, or GIGA, in Hamburg. He's also very proudly an associate fellow here at the Africa Urban Lab. Tevin is an economist, and he's his research examines how globalization and technology shape structural transformation across the global south, with a particular focus on Africa. So with that, Tevin, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Curtis. Thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to present my work.
Great. So the agenda for today, Tevin has about 25 to 30 minutes of a presentation. So he'll walk us through that presentation, presenting the main takeaways from the paper. I see he's already getting his slides queued up now, so that's great. And then after he's done with the slide presentation, we will move on swiftly into Q&A with me asking Tevin some questions about the paper. So I see you got the slides up. Without further ado, Tevin, feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready. Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, thanks again for having me and giving me the opportunity to publish my paper in the Working Paper Series of the African Urban Lab. And as Curtis has said, I'm a research fellow at the GIGA, the German Institute for Global Area Studies, and a very proud, of course, associate fellow at the Africa Urban Lab. And the paper that I will present today on the impact of industrial parks on local labor markets, evidence from Ethiopia, is joint work with Alicia Weber, who's a policy expert at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. So let me jump right into the presentation. So this is the outline for the next 25, 30 minutes or so. I will begin with motivating the paper, the research question, and outlining the key contribution of our paper. Then I will discuss other related research and the background of Ethiopia's industrial parks program. After that, I will briefly talk about the two main data sources that we are using in this paper, which is on the one hand data on Ethiopian IPs, which we compiled from Google Earth satellite imagery, and national labor force surveys, which gave us detailed information on the Ethiopian labor force over the last 20 years or so. And then I will get to the empirical strategy and the results of the paper, and then finally conclude, summarize the paper, and draw some policy lessons from our work. So to start with the motivation and contribution, as many of you in the audience will probably know, industrialization, structural transformation has been at the core of the growth agenda of the Ethiopian government, and industrial parks, which are henceforth abbreviated with as IPs, are really at the cornerstone of many of these development plans of the government. And by 2022, 22 industrial parks had been established or planned in the country, following the launch of the first industrial park, which was the Eastern Industrial Zone in 2007. And IPs have actually been quite successful in attracting massive FDI inflows into the countries, especially in the textiles and apparel manufacturing sector. So between 2013 and 2021, which is the most interesting time period of our study, FDI inflows actually tripled from around 1.3 billion to 4.3 billion. And very importantly, the IP program had even been successful to attract some big anchor investors and global brands such as H&M and PVH, part of which are, for example, Tommy Hilfiger and other brands. And while the working conditions in Ethiopian IPs have been subject to a number of research and also very good research, descriptive and experimental research, the local labor markets effects of industrial parks are beyond factory work, beyond what is going on in industrial parks, has not really been scrutinized to the same extent. So our contribution is threefold. First, our paper is among the first ones to study the Ethiopian IP program. And Ethiopia really is one of the fastest globalizing African economies. Second, we contribute by focusing on detailed local labor market dynamics and analyzing structural change in employment, heterogeneities across gender, and zooming into migration dynamics. And third, in order to do that, we use a novel continuous measure of actual industrial parks activity based on historical Google Earth satellite imagery, which I will get to a bit later. Okay, starting with the strands of related literature, of which there's, broadly speaking, three. So first is the literature that has examined the local labor market impacts of industrial parks in developing countries. And most of these studies here are actually on Asian economies. And by and large, these studies show that industrial parks can be an effective policy instrument to shift employment out of agriculture and into the modern sectors of the economy. And that has been shown for Cambodia, for China, for India, for Vietnam, which is a study by myself and co-authors. And there's also a recent study that actually looks at Ethiopia that also shows that industrial parks have caused a shift out of agricultural employment in districts that hosts industrial parks. However, what is less clear, or let me first start, what is more controversial, is where actually labor moves into. And here it really varies by country. So for example, these aforementioned studies have shown that shifts have primarily been going into manufacturing in India and Vietnam, whereas employment has primarily moved into services in India and Cambodia. And for Ethiopia, there's actually no evidence yet where most of the employment moves into in these areas where industrial parks are located, which will be subject of our study. Second, there is a strand of literature that looks at the economic impact of investment and trade liberalization in Ethiopia. Here, it has been shown that greenfield investment, and greenfield is on the greenfield FDI, new investment projects on the greenfield, so to say, are concerned. It has been shown by research that such investment can cause positive employment spillovers in local manufacturing firms. However, there's also evidence that suggests that this can sometimes come at the cost of competing local firms that are in the same sectors as the foreign investor. Also, it has been shown that the trade liberalization in Ethiopia in the late 1990s has actually caused a shift in employment from agriculture mainly into services sectors in districts that were more exposed to trade shock. But there's only been a limited movement of employment into manufacturing. And third, there's this growing literature and more recent literature that I've also referenced before that looks at the working conditions of factory work in Ethiopia. And here, various studies have shown that there's actually a high turnover in industrial parks and also industrial conflict between employers and workers in industrial parks. And other experimental research has shown that there are, especially in the short term, adverse health effects of industrial work on workers working in these export-oriented, especially light manufacturing activities in garments and footwear. Although more recent research looking into the long-term effects shows that these effects do not, negative adverse health effects do not persist over time. But I think what can generally be concluded from most of these studies is that employment in industrial parks themselves is often not much better than in the control group if we look at financial or also non-financial employment conditions. And let me now speak a bit about the background of Ethiopia's IP program. So as I mentioned before, the first industrial park that opened in the country was the Eastern Industrial Zone in 2007. That was developed and planned by two Chinese investors, the Yonghuang Group and the Quinyan Group. And this was actually a private park. And after some first successes of that industrial park, the Ethiopian government really put industrial parks and public industrial parks on its growth and development agenda, especially under the second growth and transformation plan. And so today there's 22 industrial parks, 15 of which are public and 7 of which are private. And most of these have actually already been established. And what is maybe distinct about Ethiopia's IP program is that it's strongly centrally coordinated, with a few key government institutions taking a key role in its steering and management. So we have the Ethiopian Investment Board, and first and foremost the EIB, which oversees Ethiopia's investment promotion and IP policy. Then we have the Ethiopian Investment Commission, the EIC, which focuses on the day-to-day operations of foreign investment promotion. And third, we have the IPDC, the Industrial Parks Development Corporation, which is tasked with developing and managing public industrial parks. And as like everywhere, also in Ethiopia, IPs offer a distinct regulatory regime to firms and investors operating in industrial parks. And there's on the one hand fiscal incentives and non-fiscal incentives. And among the fiscal incentives, for example, firms benefit from income tax exemptions for 10 years. They benefit from a relief from customs duties on capital goods and raw materials, and they benefit from duty-free export privileges. In terms of the non-fiscal incentives, firms that operate in industrial parks often get access to the land at lower prices, especially in public industrial parks, and they pay less for lower fees for registering their business, and often it's easier to registering the businesses and getting licenses to exports because of one-stop shops that are established in industrial parks. Let us now look at the geographical distribution and the expansion of IPs in the 2010s, which was the most dynamic period of Ethiopia's IP program. So first of all, on that map, you can see the distribution of all of the 22 Ethiopian industrial parks in the country. And so the location choice of these industrial parks really reflects a mix of economic and political considerations. So on the one hand, many of the parks are located at logistical hubs and economic hubs, like, for example, in and around Addis Ababa. But at the same time, because of Ethiopia's federal ethnically organized political structure, there's actually many regions of Ethiopia that have an own park. And here in this table, you can see all of the 22 industrial parks that had existed by 2022. So being either already operational or under planning. And what is very obvious here is that most of these parks actually became operational sometime between 2010 and 2020. And as I mentioned before, 15 of them are public parks and 7 are private parks. And let me now zoom into with some more detail into the characteristics of the activities that are going on in these industrial parks. So the majority of the activities in these industrial parks is dominated by foreign firms. And so here I've put together some illustrations using foreign direct investment projects from the Ethiopian Investment Commission. So on the left hand side, you can see a figure with a number of foreign investment projects within industrial parks and the total number of foreign investment projects. And you can clearly see an increase in the number of licensed foreign investment projects, which has grown from 8 in 2010 to 178 in 2021. And at the same time, on the right-hand side, you can see the extent to which foreign direct investment projects within industrial parks differ from those outside industrial parks in terms of their in terms of the jobs that they are creating, in terms of the investment that they draw in, right? And so what becomes clear is that IP projects within industrial parks are actually create significantly more jobs. And this includes both permanent jobs as well as temporary jobs. And this has to do with their focus. So most of these FDI projects within industrial parks are actually focusing on manufacturing activities. So 96% of them are focusing on manufacturing activities within industrial parks compared to only 62% outside industrial parks. And almost half of these the FDI projects within industrial parks actually focusing on textiles and apparel activities, compared to only 12% of foreign investment projects outside industrial parks. And these types of activities are very labor intensive, which explains the results in this figure on the right-hand side here. Okay, let me now speak a bit about the 2 main data sources that we use. So on the one hand side, we use as our measure of IP activity, we construct IP exposure from historic satellite imagery. And here we follow an approach that we've already used in another paper on Vietnam, which we validated there as well. And what we exploit is a neat feature in Google Earth Pro, which is the availability of historic satellite imagery. And very conveniently, especially for our use case, historic satellite imagery for Ethiopia exists almost monthly since the mid-late 2010s, when so right before the IP program in the country really kickstarted. So it covers, so we have satellite imagery of these locations where eventually the industrial parks were built for all of them actually in the country. And so what we do is that we first geolocate all of the industrial parks on the satellite imagery, and then we trace their growth using the historic images using polygons actually, where we draw polygons around the built-up area of industrial parks. But I'll get to the details in a second. And the key assumption that we make is essentially that we can proxy changes in industrial park activity by the built-up area of IPs. And it has actually been shown by Bilica and Seidel in a recent paper that that the built-up area of especially of manufacturing firms is even a better proxy for a firm's activity, especially over time, than, for example, light data, which is commonly used in the literature, and much better, obviously, than a simple dummy indicator for whether park exists or not, right? And when we do like a double check, a robustness check, we actually also see a high correlation between the build-up area of an industrial park and the cumulative greenfield FDI investment that has gone into industrial park in Ethiopia. So this is the one data set that we use. And the other one is the Ethiopian labor force survey, which we obtained from the Ethiopian Statistical Service. And from that data, we get micro level outcome data. And we use, which gives us information on what workers, what types of work the workforce in Ethiopia actually engages in. And here we use 3 waves of the NLFS, the National Labor Force Survey, from 2005, 2013, and 2021. And as I mentioned, that data set contains detailed information on the type of employment of workers, including the work status, so whether an individual is a wage worker, an account worker, an unpaid family worker, on the employer's organization, so whether a worker is employed in a household business, a private enterprise, or the public sector, and on the type of sector that a worker is employed in. So, for example, whether a worker is employed in agriculture, in manufacturing, or in services. And another neat aspect of that data is that we have that information, or we have information on these individuals at a very detailed geographic level. So at the force administrative ward level, and in Ethiopia, these are the kebeles, so the villages or the towns. And this is like the most detailed administrative level there is in the country. And so we have that information on around 385,000 individuals in the country from around 1,900 wards, so villages or towns. And as I mentioned, I wanted to show you an example of our mapping exercise. So in this figure, you can see the expansion of the 2 largest industrial parks in the country, the Eastern Industrial Zone, Ethiopia's first industrial park, which was private, and then the Hawassa Industrial Park, the first, not the first, but the largest public industrial park. And you can clearly see how the build-up area of these 2 IPs has grown from 2009 for the IZ and 2014 for Hawassa until 2021. So in the initial image, there had been no built-up structures whatsoever. And then by 2021, you can see all the sheds and the factories. And what we did here, with the help of very diligent students' assistants, was that we drew the built-up area using these polygons around, or we drew polygons around the built-up area of these industrial parks, which then measured the hectares actually that are covered of the park, that are covered by built-up structures over time. And this is essentially the result of that exercise. So here you can see all of Ethiopia's industrial parks, except for the 4 agricultural, industrial, agro-processing industrial parks, which we exclude because they are focused on a different sector and have mostly not become operational by 2021, which is the final year of our study period. But you can see for the remaining 18 industrial parks, the built-up area measured in hectares in the 3 years for which we have worker level survey data in 2005, 2013, and 2021. And what becomes clear is that in 2005, no IPs actually had existed, also not visibly existed on satellite imagery. And then by 2013, the first two IPs, the EIZ and the Bolelemi Industrial Park, had been partially established, having a built-up area of 4 and 45 hectares respectively. And then all of the remaining, or most of the remaining urban industrial parks have become operational between 2013 and 2021. And as I mentioned, the table excludes the 4 integrated agro-industrial parks. And so the total build-up area of all IPs grew from 0 in 2005, so first year of our study period, to 827 hectares in 2021. And the average IP size measured as built-up area in 2021 was 46 hectares. However, there's, as you can see, significant variation across IPs, right? So there's very large ones like the Eastern Industrial Zone, which has like 263 hectares, or also the Wasa Industrial Park with 113 hectares. But then there's also smaller ones like the Velocity Industrial Park and the DBL Industrial Park. And that variation we will also exploit in our empirical framework that I'll get to in a bit. So what we do is that we combine the two data sources. On the one hand, our measure of IP exposure and our measure and our worker level data from the labor force surveys. And so in this map of Ethiopia, you can see all of the household or worker level, household level locations in our survey, shown as the yellow dots, and as the red and purple dots, the operational and the planned IPs. And what is clear here is that many of these IPs, or around most of these IPs, we actually do have household level locations, and actually multiple household locations within many districts, right? So, which is something that we will exploit in our empirical framework. So our very detailed geographical information where these workers actually live. And in this table, you can see some pre-treatment location characteristics. Here we show the key worker level and ward level characteristics prior to the implementation of industrial parks, which is averaged between across the 2005 and 2013 NLFS waves. And the key message from that table is that locations closer to IPs are more densely populated. They are more urban. The workforce is older and more educated. And on average, these locations have more wage work and private enterprises and a higher share of manufacturing activities. So let's now get into our empirical strategy. So our baseline empirical framework is a two-way fixed effect specification where we have essentially 3 treatment terms. And as I mentioned, treatment is IP exposure measured as the built-up area of IPs within, and here, that's why we have, and now I mentioned why we have 3 treatment terms. So we have the, so this is an individual level specification, and we have a treatment term for the total build-up area within 0 to 10 kilometers of an individual, within 10 to 20 kilometers, and within 20 to 13 kilometers of workers, right? And with this, we want to examine to what extent these effects are actually spatial, right? So to what extent individuals living closer to industrial parks are exposed differently or affected differently from individuals living further away from industrial parks. And the main outcomes that we use are the type of employment, the sector of employment, and migration. And the key controls in the specification are individual year and ward year controls, as well as year, district, and district year fixed effect. And obviously, there's like identification concerns in the specification, which we account for partially by controlling for individual level characteristics and water level characteristics, as well as these fixed effects. But still, locations with IPs or individuals living close to IPs may live in locations that are on a different trajectory from individuals that live in locations that are further away from industrial parks. And we do test for that by estimating placebo regressions, where we have artificial treatment terms, where we interact year dummies with the eventual IP exposure. So year dummies for 2005 and 2013, before most IPs had been constructed with the eventual IP exposure variable, and the coefficient in these placebo regressions, the coefficients should be insignificant because in these pre-intervention periods, there should not be an effect of the intervention. And this is actually what we confirm in our placebo regressions, which I could show you later on, maybe in the discussion. And then we do also employ a series of robustness checks using alternative outcomes, because the outcomes in the main specifications refer to the last 7 days. We also use outcomes that refer to the last 12 months. We do use different treatment variables and different samples, for example, excluding individuals living in ADIs, where most of or many IPs have been constructed, in which are the most urban locations. And all of these identification and robustness checks actually confirm our key results that I will show you next. And there's 4 results that I would like to highlight in this presentation specifically. So first, we document a shift from own account and family work to wage work around expanding IPs. So here in these charts, you can see the impact of industrial parks on individuals at different spatial distance spins. And so we focus as outcomes here on the type of employment, and the coefficients here are interpreted as the percentage point change that is associated with 10 hectare increase in built up IP area. And what we find is that we find a 1.5 percentage point 5% and a 2.5 percentage point decrease in own account and unpaid family work within 10 kilometers of industrial parks, and an increase, a 3.9 percentage point or 6% increase. This is always the percent. Figures are always estimated based on the baseline shares across these different types of employment. So a 3.9 percentage point increase or 6% increase in wage work within 10 kilometers of IPs. And what is striking is that these effects are very local, right? So they are concentrated around 0 to 10 kilometers, so very nearby industrial parks, and then dissipate across space and mostly become insignificant beyond 10 kilometers. So we find a shift from own account and family work to wage work. And in line with that, we find, or consistent with that, we find a shift from agriculture to mainly construction and partially manufacturing. So here the coefficients can be interpreted in the same way. So we find a 5.8 percentage point or a very large 85% decrease in agriculture within 10 kilometers of expanding IPs, and a movement into manufacturing and construction. So a 0.9 percentage point or 6% increase in manufacturing, and this is mainly driven by textiles, and a 3.7 percentage point increase in construction, or a very large 32% increase in construction within 10 kilometers of IPs. And again, the effects dissipate rapidly beyond 10 kilometers of expanding IPs. And then third, if we now look at the differential effects for men and women, since we know anecdotally that especially employment in these industrial parks is highly concentrated among women, and we do also find significant differences in IP-induced sectoral shifts between men and women. So we find that men shift primarily from agriculture to construction, and also actually partially into services. And for women, we see a lot less strong shift into construction from agriculture. And the shift out of agriculture is now actually not significant anymore, but a stronger movement into manufacturing, in line with descriptive evidence on working characteristics in industrial parks, and especially and like 2/3 of the manufacturing effect is actually driven by shifts into textiles and apparel. And finally, if we look at migration, and so here it is anecdotally well known that migrants are an important, a large share of the workforce in industrial parks is actually migrants, and that these industrial parks can draw in migrants from surrounding locations, and that's why we look at migration as well, and we do find actually an expansion, an increase in migration around expanding IPs, but the previously documented employment effects are actually concentrated among the non-migrant population. So it's not that these prior effects are driven by only by migrants, right? And so first, in this figure, we show that in the middle chart of the upper figure here, you can see that the overall increase in migration within 0 to 10 kilometers is primarily driven by very recent inwards migration, so within the last 5 years. And this is very much in line with, consistent with industrial parks drawing in people, workers or individuals from other locations. However, if we now distinguish between two samples, one including only, put differently, one including the total sample, including migrants, which are the first 4 columns, and then one including only the local population, so excluding migrants, we actually see that the results are very similar, right? And if the results were merely driven by migration, then the results in columns 4 to 8, they should be the effects should be much more attenuated, right? Or there should be no effects at all. But what we see here is actually the results excluding migrants show the same shift from agriculture to primarily construction and partially manufacturing, if we also only focus on the local population, right? And the biggest difference we can actually see between the effect on manufacturing, which is slower, which is smaller if we only look at the local population, like a third smaller, which suggests, also in line with anecdotal evidence, that migrants actually are an important population within the workforce of industrial parks. So let me conclude. Ethiopia has accelerated its integration into manufacturing global supply chains over the last decades, and it has done so primarily through these export-oriented IPs in light manufacturing, especially in textiles and apparel. And this study presents early causal evidence on the local labor market impacts of Ethiopia's IP strategy. And we do find that IPs very locally, very nearby, reallocate employment away from agriculture, but that manufacturing effects so far remain modest and limited to employment within IPs themselves, and not so much beyond IPs, right? And this is actually consistent with some of the prior evidence, especially on the episodes of trade liberalization that I've referenced earlier. And what we do document is actually a large shift from agriculture into construction. So we do see this urbanization taking place, and we do think that this raises very interesting new questions on household level impacts around IPs, such as on household level income, access to roads, electricity, and so forth. And let me now end by drawing a few policy lessons from our study. So first of all, I think it is very important for policymakers generally, but especially Ethiopia particularly, to keep in mind to have realistic expectations, right? So Ethiopia's IP program is still pretty young by international comparison. So many of the industrial parks programs that are in the context of other countries that are referenced earlier that have partially also shown this shift in the manufacturing, they're much older, right? So Ethiopia's program is, let's say, 10 years old. So since it has really picked up steam, and many of these other programs are several decades old, right? So when looking at the aggregate impacts of industrial parks, then by extensions of Ethiopia's integration into these light manufacturing supply chains, it is important to keep this in view and take this into account, right? And I think another important point is that despite this, I think partial success or early success of kickstarting this export-oriented light manufacturing sector, it has to be kept in mind that agricultural GVCs still dominate in Ethiopia. So textiles and apparel is still only Ethiopia's 5th most important export category, behind coffee, behind vegetables, and other agricultural products. And so it is still early also when we think about that. So, and that's why also the local impacts are probably still modest, right? Since the exports are still minor compared to other sectors. And second, the second aspect, and I think this goes a bit beyond our study, is it speaks more to some of the more recent developments that we can see around Ethiopia's export-oriented manufacturing sector, and this concerns diversification. So most of these, most of the exports from industrial parks actually served a single market, which is the US market, and herein of course lie weaknesses, right, or risks, which became very obvious over the course of the AGOA withdrawal when the Tigray War started, where Ethiopia lost its duty-free access to the US market, and with that, the export-oriented manufacturing sector in industrial parks in Ethiopia actually suffered a lot, and has since then, over the last three years or so, stagnated or even declined, right? And so it seems clear that for more widespread benefits from integrating into manufacturing GVCs, diversification beyond textile and apparel is paramount. On one hand, sectoral diversification, and then on the other hand, export diversification in terms of destination markets. And third, I think what should be forgotten is the important role of complementary policies. So our evidence suggests that spillovers are still limited. For spillovers of industrial parks are limited, and the related research on FDI and trade in Ethiopia points to a similar direction. So the linkages to local firms really have to be strengthened to capitalize from integrating into global supply chains. And broader institutional reforms, such as an open trade investment regime, And again, I would highlight AGOA here, as well as a strengthened education system, especially to get to the next stage of value addition beyond just assembly and like manufacturing is really key, right? And these two factors are among another list of a broader list or a more numerous list of factors is really important to amplify the gains from GVC integration through export-oriented industrial parks. Okay, and with that, I would end, and yeah, let's jump into the discussion, Curtis.
Great. Thank you so much, Tevin. That was an awesome presentation, really fascinating paper. So yeah, let's jump straight into the Q&A. Just first, maybe let me start just big picture. There's now it's seemingly this solid stack of you could say micro evidence on place-based industrial policies like SEZs, like industrial parks, kind of in China, you mentioned in Cambodia, yours and your co-authors' work in Vietnam that recently was published. As you mentioned, mostly focused on Asia. Yours is one of the first to bring, I guess, rigorous micro-level quantitative evidence on sort of place-based industrial policy to the African context, along with a few other scant papers. So I guess what I would say is sort of this type of paper isn't just filling a minor gap in the literature, right? Africa needs like something like 20 million new jobs per year. Its cities, which the AUL is concerned with, are growing faster than anywhere on Earth. And so the huge kind of hairy open question is whether those cities can become, engines of structural transformation, which your paper gets at, or whether on the flip side they can become, seas of joblessness if that employment isn't generated somehow by these firms that grow in scale over time. So I guess before we get into the findings and unpack the findings that you just went over, high level, why, number one, has this evidence gap persisted for so long, for like this lack of sort of African-based studies on the impact of zones and parks? And more fundamentally, like what are the key things that are at stake in knowing whether the sort of Asian SEZ playbook travels well to the Africa context? And I know you've worked in both contexts on zones and parks, so feel free to bring in work from your Asian work.
Yeah, I think for the first question, I think two main facts that explain that come to mind, right? So the first one being the substantive point, right? So why have there been? So your first question was why is there scant evidence, right? And the first point is, research only focuses on or empirical research only focuses on cases where you do really see something on the ground, right? And while there have been industrial policies, especially like these place-based policies in a number of African countries, I think many of them, and there's like some syntheses, so research that tries to synthesize like the different industrial parks programs and how successful they were, and they use different proxies to assess that. And I think one maybe sobering reality is that in Africa, by and large, many of these programs have not been that successful, and that is usually measured. You can usually measure that by the occupancy rate of industrial park, right? So let's say, how many of the sheds that were built are actually occupied, or how many firms have been formed, or how many investors could be drawn in, or how much light do these parks emit? And I think many of these programs have not been that successful by many of these measures. And then obviously, if you don't see much of economic activity being generated in these parks in the first place, there's not much sense in looking, into the, let's say, spillover effects, into the, let's say, broader labor market effects or firm level effects of these industrial park programs, right? Because you just wouldn't expect anything to show up, right? If you're not successful in attracting, let's say, foreign investors or getting firms to start operations in these parks, you wouldn't even expect something to happen. And I think some of the earlier overview articles actually show that, right? That many of these parks actually failed to generate economic activity. And then the more interesting research question is not like the impact on the local economy. It's more, why did they fail, right? And I think that's what some of the earlier research has gone into or looked into, but they're more on a cross-country basis, right? So let's say you look at all of Africa and you have your variation in, I don't know, different institutional setup and business climate and whatsoever. And then you look at the correlation between like the business environment and other institutional factors and the success measured by light emission of firm creation in these industrial parks, right? And so that's what some of these earlier studies did, and that's I think is the more relevant question that many of these studies looked into. And I mean we can talk about the factors. Maybe I can get to that in a second when addressing a second point. But that's why I think that's the substantive point why for a long time there have not been studies or there have not been any studies on Africa, right? And many of these studies are in Asia because Asian industrial parks or SEZ programs, by and large, have been more successful. If we think of China, if we think of Vietnam, or if we think of India, right? And that's why just the economic case, like there's like more a strong economic case to look into those, right? And then the other, like the second point would maybe be more like a practical one, and that's data, right? So to look to examine these effects, you need to have the data to be able to do so. And maybe the easiest, it's not easy, but the way, I mean, there's maybe different ways that one could do it, right? There's on the one hand, you can use like micro level data on firms and workers. And that's challenging for many African countries because, so for example, let's contrast, because I've worked in Vietnam, as I mentioned before, let's contrast the Vietnamese data to the Ethiopian data, right? So in Vietnam, there's like an annual labor force survey. And it's actually even quarterly, right? So they collect the data even more frequently to account for cyclicalities and so on, seasonalities. And then in Ethiopia, you have a labor force survey every 8 years. Okay, so and then Ethiopia is even good at having a labor force survey, right? So
I was going to say, like, that's good.
Yeah, that's even good, right?
The African context.
Yes, there's also other countries that do have labor force surveys, obviously, but then but there's also many countries and also some of the economically stronger countries actually don't have any labor force surveys, right? And then that prevents you from looking at these employment shifts, how we did it, even in contexts where maybe that would be a useful thing to do, right? Because you see that industrial parks have generated some activity. And what then, as an alternative, studies use, for example, the DHS. And there's the recent paper, it just came out very recently on Ethiopia, actually, which together with ours is, I think, the first one that looks at Ethiopia. And they look at because they use the DHS, they have a stronger focus on a household level analysis, because then you can capture well with the DHS because you have information on household assets, for example, and access to infrastructure, electricity, and these types of questions. But they are less detailed on questions regarding the type of employment, right? What I mentioned in my presentation, right? So where actually do these, what are the occupations, what are the sectors, what are the types of employment actually that are affected, or how are different types of employment or sectors affected by these industrial parks that you can usually only look at using labor force surveys. And then another outcome that one could use is, like, as I mentioned, also like light data, right? And some studies have actually done that, but that's obviously a bit more broad, right? So, and also it's difficult to distinguish between the light that is being emitted from, so it's more difficult to distinguish between the effect, the economic activity that is generated within the industrial park from the activity outside the industrial park, right? So for example, if you look at a district and you look at the impact of industrial park that industrial park had on light emission in that district, then obviously within the overall light emission in the district, you have the light emission of the industrial park, right? And it's very difficult to tease that out, right? And so it's less easy to distinguish between the direct and the indirect effects of industrial parks, where like using microdata is actually much more useful because you know exactly where these individual works and the types of employment where they work. And okay, that was a long answer to your first question. And the answer to your second question, does the Asian playbook can it travel to Africa? I think it's difficult to speak. Maybe let me maybe question the premise of your question, because I think there's not really an Asian playbook, because these countries pursued different types of industrial park programs and different types of strategies, and it often like the political system plays an important role, right? So, for example, in Vietnam, you have a very the whole industrial parks program was very decentral, and it was very decentral because the provincial parties of the Communist Party, the provincial not parties, there's another word for it, but the provincial offices of the Communist Party in Vietnam, they had substantial influence in the location of industrial parks, actually, and they competed actually with each other, right? And they could use their own incentives, right, to attract industrial parks, right? So you had a much more diverse set of actors, local actors, that try to incentivize also foreign firms, also local firms, but primarily foreign firms, to start operations. Whereas, for example, in other programs, also like the Ethiopian one, and as I mentioned, like the majority of these parks are public, right? 15 out of 22 are public, and all of them are actually these parks are being developed by the Industrial Parks Development Corporation. So it's a federal organization. So it's much more top down and less bottom up. And so, and I wouldn't argue one way or the other, right? Because both, I think, both things can have their pros and cons, right? So, like the decentral approach, of course, the advantage of it is that obviously, like the local, let's say, political party and the local players know the local context better. They know the needs better. They know the locations that are better suited, right? This is great. But then on the other hand, if you have, let's say, in a country like Ethiopia, it's very difficult actually to convince investors to invest in your country in the first place. And that's actually what you saw in Ethiopia, that the government, it was very important that the government played such a big role in getting these investors, like especially these anchor investors, to the country. So maybe now, as I'm saying it, probably in the early stage, it's very important to have this the government, the central government, playing a more important role, maybe, right, for steering the program. And then later on, probably you do want to incentivize the local governments to you want them to give them more responsibility so that they compete with each other and then are incentivized to attract foreign investors, and they know their locations best, right, and where to best place these industrial parks. So I mean, it's always a bit I like to say it depends, right? Like, I think it depends. It really depends on the country which playbook works best for them. And Ethiopia actually learned a lot from China, from the Chinese approach when devising, which was more, especially in the beginning, was more centralized. And then Vietnam followed more like as I read it, like the Taiwanese approach, which was more decentral, right? And obviously there's always past dependency. So China, beyond industrial parks, is an important investor in Ethiopia, right, in infrastructure. So it does make sense to maybe to learn from them, right, because there's already close links between administrations.
Yeah, lots to get into, but I'm realizing we're pressed for time, and I have several questions I want to get to. So moving on, I wanted to dig into the manufacturing findings for a bit, right? Basically, you found, and like, correct me if I'm putting the findings right, but a 6% increase, or 0.9 percentage point increase in the probability of manufacturing employment nearby industrial parks. And this increase, from what I understand, is concentrated basically entirely in textiles and apparel, right? And then in your own work in Vietnam, industrial parks delivered substantially larger shifts into manufacturing. And so I was thinking about this, zooming out. Like, I mean, on paper, Ethiopia, they basically did everything right? They have like really low wages. They've got duty-free market access to the U.S. under AGOA. I think they have other free trade agreements. They've got these amazing anchor tenants that you mentioned, H&M, PVH. There's Industrial Parks Corporation that the PM, the Prime Minister, basically chairs the industrial board, the investment board. So with all of this, these boxes checked, why this sort of modest findings? As you said, it's like a tentative success, and it's early. It might be too early to tell. And we had COVID in 2020, and we had a civil conflict in Ethiopia. So all these might be factors, but like, what would you say, zooming out from these kind of uncontrollable factors, COVID, the civil conflict, what would you say is the binding constraint? One of the things I was plausibly thinking of, for example, was, could your findings in this Ethiopia paper partially be evidence of, like, Danny Roderick and some others recently voiced concerns that manufacturing today is sort of no longer the reliable conveyor belt to rising productivity and mass job creation that it once was, especially when East Asia and sort of some later Southeast Asian countries went through sort of their structural transformation. What do you think? And feel free to navel gaze. Like, you can speculate beyond the findings of your paper if you want.
Yeah. I mean, first on the magnitude of the effects. Yeah, I think. I mean, you've already mentioned it. I think. So just to repeat the effects. So the effect that we find. I mean, you mentioned the size, right? 6% increase in manufacturing, mainly in textiles, within like 10 kilometers of industrial parks. And this suggests that most of that is direct employment creation. Also, the fact that the effect is stronger for women, right? So the effect is mostly a direct effect, employment generation in industrial parks. And why is it not higher? And I think the explanation, as mentioned by you, is that, comparatively speaking, Ethiopia is a huge country, right? And Ethiopia has like 120 or 130 million people living there, and like in the workforce, probably there's like 78 or 90 million, 78 to 90 million, something like that. And so that's why it takes a lot actually to make an effect, right, in the aggregate statistics of such a huge country, right? And you do need to draw in quite substantive investment and direct. And since these effects are direct, right? So you need to have quite substantive direct job creation for this to actually show up and not be washed, out and washed away, especially in a specification where you just have a sample, right? And you have like the usual data issues, right? So, and that's why I think, and that's why I also try to stress the point that it's still pretty early, right? And right. For example, in Vietnam, where you see stronger effects, in Vietnam, the first industrial parks had been established in the early 90s. So they have like 20 years more than Ethiopia has, right? So I think this is like, and as you mentioned, I think Ethiopia actually did quite a lot right. I think one question is always like, to what extent do you concentrate on one sector, and or rather broaden your view and try to attract investors from a range of sectors. And I think like the historical evidence shows that focusing especially on textiles and apparel and footwear in particular, initially can be a good strategy, right? And that's what many countries actually did, right? So so obviously Vietnam now did it, and now they actually now textiles and apparel is only the third or fourth most important export sector, and electronics is by far the most export sector. China also did it, right? Other countries are trying to do it, like Bangladesh, for example. So I think the strategy makes sense. I think the question is just how far can you go with that strategy, right? So I think early on, it's good to focus and to create these jobs. But then, and I think this is also one of the points to get to the second part of your question, like the whole discussion around, is manufacturing still the manufacturing path, the export-oriented manufacturing path to development, still feasible? And I mean, it seems a bit that the consensus is shifting a bit, that the time for manufacturing, is over in a sense, and export-oriented manufacturing, because of like many of the issues. I think some of them you also raised, because of automation, right? And so you just don't need as many people anymore in many of these activities. Then because it's very competitive, right? You do have like these Asian, very productive Asian competitors, which these Asian countries didn't have, right? Because wages were already much higher in Europe, where these activities were before. And maybe the wage differential is not as high, between the African countries and the Asian countries, although it may be increasing. And then obviously you have this whole geoeconomic fragmentation and geopolitical tensions, and now tariffs on being raised. So that's why I do understand the argument. However, because of two reasons, I'm still skeptical, and I'd still, if I would advise, you don't need to put all your eggs in one basket, but of course you need to prioritize to some extent. And I would probably still, it depends as always on the capabilities of the country and the endowments of the country and where you're at. But I would probably I would not give up on the manufacturing route to development, because of two main reasons, actually. And the one reason is just the historical evidence that, except maybe for a few small countries that could specialize because of their geographic location on professional services, and these types of activities, except for those, and all countries that, that climbed the development ladder after the Second World War, and this includes the Tiger countries in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then more recently countries like China, but also Vietnam. They've all done it actually through manufacturing, and there's just no other example of especially large countries that have done it. So that's like more the historical empirical case, and then the other is more like the arguments and the theoretical arguments. So, and this is just because manufacturing just has these features. So you have tradable goods that are amenable to codified knowledge and innovation, and where you can serve richer customers abroad. And I know the arguments from the other side, right? That many of like these services sectors have the same characteristics, right? That some of these new services, you can also export them, and you also have innovation there, and that may be true in some areas, right? I don't know, if you look at McDonald's and automation in that sector, and some of that retail, like food retail business, that may be true, or I don't know, maybe some BPOs, yes, but then you have the risk of AI actually. So especially now with AI, I wouldn't bank on that, and so I don't buy it fully, to be honest. Like that, and if I look at, especially if I look at most of the services, and you know that very well as a scholar in urban development. If you look at types of service activities in many African countries, they are so far away from these services that have, that can be automated and where you have formal employment actually at scale. That, I mean, I lack the imagination to see the jump, right, from the status quo to that, export oriented, high productivity services sector that creates employment at scale. Just because it didn't exist before, and especially now with AI, right, where there's lots of incentive to automate even further with these capable AI models, right, in this sector. So I would still say that I would still bank on manufacturing, and probably advise many of these countries to get a hold and to get a foot in the door of some of the manufacturing activities. And what exactly and where and when, I think that is really context specific and depends. But I mean, and there's like now a big discussion on industrial policy, right? Like many organizations, including the World Bank, are focusing on industrial policy and put that on the map again, and to what extent industrial policies can push that. And there's also a very neat empirical papers actually. Of course, passport policy is industrial policy, but also the role of industrial policy in some of these Asian countries like Korea. There's a few papers on for example, the industrial policies targeting shipbuilding and heavy industries, and how that actually spilled over to other sectors, and was very successful in raising living standards in Korea. So I think there is evidence actually that industrial policies can play a key role. However, and that's maybe to link it back to our our study, that is that of course industrial policies come with a cost. And if you contrast, there's actually a World Bank report from 2022, a very thorough one that descriptively examines Ethiopia's industrial parks program and how much it costs. Right?
I recently read it. It's a really good, it's a paper, right? Yeah.
I think, I'm not sure if it's by Abebe. I'm not sure. I think I have another one in mind. But Abebe has done great work on Ethiopia too. But where they go through like really the business case of industrial, so really like more like the business case of industrial parks, and the return that they need to generate in order to recoup the initial investment, right? Because they are expensive, right? This program, I don't have the exact figure now on top of my mind, but it is quite a, well, how much was it? Like it's more, I think more than 7-8 billion or so for a country like Ethiopia. That's a lot, right? And to recoup it, and then that's only the costs, right? To develop the park, because you have the industrial park development organization that, at least for the public parks, that is developing them, so public investment, and then you have like foregone revenue, right? Because these firms get all the tax breaks, right? And then it takes time actually to recoup the investment through, I don't know, like the taxes on salaries of the workers, or I don't know, other types of taxes that are levied on the firms that operate, other income taxes that are not exempt, or value-added taxes. I don't know. So and so far, these parks in Ethiopia, they are far away from being profitable, and so. And maybe again, this would be too much to expect within the span of a few years, but it's very hard, right? So doing industrial policy, effectively is a very hard thing, and that's where I think competency also is very important. The capability of the local administration to have like a smart bureaucracy that knows, in the ministries, like smart people who know like what can be effective policies, right? And to try to involve the private sector as much as possible, right? It's probably a good. So it's always a useful solution or a good approach.
Yeah, and uh, to your point of it, it takes a while. I think it especially takes a while when, as in the case of Ethiopia, it's a federated country, and this isn't just a purely economic exercise. Starting these parks, it's a political exercise, and I know Dr. Arkebe has even written about this somewhere about him having to spread around these parks across regions and into places, locations that he otherwise said, like, yeah, this is dumb. This is purely a political park that we're setting up here, but we need to, in order to make the parks program actually go forward and get the coalitions of support behind it that are required to make it happen. So it's almost unfair evaluating all 22 parks when most of the people implementing them know that a nice share of these parks are like basically political. You know what I mean?
Yes, sure.
But by the way, Tevin, you were right. It's not Abebe. The World Bank paper, for listeners, is by Fanuel, Butler, and Grinstead.
Exactly.
On the path of industrialization.
Exactly.
So I want to ask a couple more questions. So onwards and upwards. So one question, I think it has to do with your last slide on your policy lessons, and the last policy lesson that you mentioned was sort of complementary interventions. And so this is right. Basically, you found that all the effects sort of die after beyond 10 kilometers from the parks, and they die pretty sharply, right? And in the paper, you attribute this partly to, I guess, like transport costs or linkages binding pretty hard in the Ethiopian context, given the low income levels. If you go to pay for like a bus fare, that's actually pretty expensive if you have a very low income, and that makes sort of traveling longer distances sometimes prohibitively expensive, right? This seems to me, is from putting my city's hat on and being at the Africa Urban Lab, this seems hugely consequential for urban policy, right? It says the parks, basically the benefit zone of these parks is essentially a pretty small, tiny point within this much broader urban labor market, which puts like enormous weight on where you put the park and what you build around it, worker housing, feeder roads, kind of transit links. I think, for example, Hawasa's well-documented struggles in the early days of the Hawassa Park with worker housing, with turnover and attrition come to mind. So I guess, are African governments treating zones and industrial park siting and the sort of surrounding urban fabric as seriously as they treat the industrial infrastructure inside, within the fences of these parks? Right. I guess what I'm getting at is, do you know of any of these Ethiopian industrial parks that saw, your word is perfect, complementary investments in a bunch of roads and connective transit in the broader urban area in the city in which these parks are located, so that a larger proportion of their urban labor market could access jobs within the park?
Yeah, I think I think that's like a very important point, and that point, the extent to which complementary investments were present and well thought through, that determines the full package in a sense, not only the industrial parks, but the full package that was implemented. I think that is the key differentiating factor in determining the success or failure of an industrial park. And I think that's actually what some of the earliest studies that looked at that cross-sectionally across like different African countries also document, right? So in cases where you do have more of these complementary investments, it is just more likely that you draw in investors, right? Because they can more easily get the workers that they need for the operations, and they can more easily ship their goods out of the park to the next, port or airport, for example, right?
And in China, China's special economic zones, for example, are like city scale zones. They're
exactly.
Some of them,
that's right,
dozens or like hundreds of kilometers in scope. So it's like, by virtue of how they've defined the zones, they almost include all of these additional complementary investments that need to be made, whereas these Ethiopian parks seem slightly smaller, and like they're kind of dozens of hectares rather than dozens of kilometers.
Exactly. For China, it's actually economic zones. It's not really industrial parks. It's like, as you say, it is these vast geographic areas that are assigned an economic zone, right? Or assigned as an economic zone, and where all the firms that are in that area, like in this whole district, for example, they all benefit from these incentives, right? And I think, here, I think what has to get back to why using industrial parks to begin with, right? And I think, and what type of, maybe let's use a broader term, special economic zones, right? Because you have like different types of special economic zones, and industrial parks are really clearly delineated production located, right? With clear borders. And the key reason of having them, especially in contexts that otherwise lack the infrastructure, is that at least in these contexts where you alternatively don't have reliable energy for electricity, for example, or good, like infrastructure and permitting and these types of things, at least there you have it, right? So that's why that's the argument for having it concentrated in a specific, smaller location in contexts where, let's say, the infrastructure is otherwise lacking these key characteristics. So that's why I wouldn't now advise to, like, for example, Ethiopia, to follow the exact same approach as China, right? And broadening the economic zone to the total district, because this is just not realistic. Probably this wouldn't work anyway, right? And probably you cannot practically enforce it or implement it, and then you won't even draw in any investor, right? So, so I think that complementary back to the point of complementary investment, I think that's something where it would be great to see also more research. As I mentioned before, like a lot of the prior research looked at it like cross-sectionally, like more correlationally, like by looking at different countries. But now using more like micro data, I think it would be very interesting to link. And I think there's like I know of one paper that is trying to do that on Vietnam, linking these specific complementary investments or characteristics to the effectiveness of special economic zones, again, for Vietnam. And I think this is something which would be very practical and very useful for policymakers, right? To know exactly, okay, where do we have to put these parks, right, in order for them to be successful, or at least to know it, right? Because as you say, to know it, like what makes sense economically is one thing, but then to implement is another thing, because political considerations and equity considerations also play a role, right? Because you do want to place an industrial park in each province, for example, in the country, or in rural areas, because you want to make sure that especially the rural population is not left behind, right? So, but at least like where economically it would make the most sense, right? But that's I think that's something where more work would be, to see more work on that, I think would be very interesting.
Okay, great. I realize we're coming on time here. So last question for you, Tevin, and it's more forward looking. You're doing some comparative work. You've done this paper on Vietnam on zones. You've done this industrial parks work on Ethiopia. For the lab, I know you're working on some more stuff around on zones and industrial park policy. If you had the dream data set and you had a willing government partner, what's the next paper that you'd write on top of this one that you went over today? And I guess maybe for the policymakers watching, say someone designing, Tanzania's next generation of special economic zones, what would be the single most, or at least the key important thing your Ethiopian evidence tells this policymaker to do or not to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think in terms of what type of data you would really like to have is like detailed micro level data, right? So, for example, for the Ethiopian case, it would have been very nice to have like these labor force surveys much more frequently, than just every 8 years, and also even greater detail. So I think just having more better micro data is very crucial to know what's going on in the local labor market, right? And how people are impacted in your country by specific policies. So having it more frequently would be great. And then having it even a broader set of indicators. So for example, one thing that what we can't do in the paper is to do a thorough analysis of the welfare implications of the workers, because data on income beyond wage income is not collected. And as you will know, like most of the individuals are not in wage work in these contexts, right? So they're like self-employed, they're own account workers, are many are unpaid employees. And only very few are wage workers. And so for example, for the Ethiopian case, information on income, of also those own account workers, at a broad level would be really nice, right? So more detailed, more frequent and more detailed micro level data, I think that would be really something very neat. And then in terms of maybe the key thing to take from my paper also for Tanzania and other African countries, I think one always has to be careful to draw too broad inferences from or conclusions from just a single paper. And the nice thing is that there's a number of papers. So I mentioned this other paper that just a few weeks ago came out, also focusing on industrial parks on Ethiopia, that focuses more on like also level aspects. That's like very complementary to my work, right? And so I think taking to like and then if I especially if I want to draw some policy conclusions, I think it's very important to keep in mind the whole body of literature, right? So I would, but based on what I've learned from working, on industrial parks and their local impacts and their successes and failures in different contexts and in different countries, I think one key aspect that one has to bear in mind is that, it's always easier said than done, right? So I would always be hesitant to be like overly confident in saying that, but because implementing that in practice is very difficult. But to also think of domestic firms when designing these industrial policies, right? And so I do understand, and I think it's totally understandable and also correct to, especially early on when you don't have an industrial base, right? And the knowledge and skills. So neither at the firm level nor at the work level to participate in some of these sophisticated supply chains. It's I think a good idea to attract foreign investors, right? But I would advise these governments to include domestic firms in the policy from the outset. And there's like various ways how you can do that. There's like more strict ways, like regulation-wise, right? That you have, for example, something like local content requirements, right? That a certain share of inputs, that go into the production of these export-oriented goods, produced by foreign firms, that you have to have, local inputs. I think there's a growing literature on that, like whether that is a good idea or not. I think in some cases it can be a good idea, in other cases. But as I said, this is like maybe a more severe regulation than one could take. But there's other approaches like matchmaking, right? Just to get these firms together, or I don't know, like having having programs whereby you try to make it easier to have like rotation of workers across foreign and domestic firms so that learning can take place. Because what some studies show is actually that the domestic firms that eventually make it to a high level of sophistication, that the workers that founded those firms or that take key positions had actually prior worked in the foreign firm, right? And so enabling these transitions, for example, and there's like multiple ways how one could do it and go about it, but to think of that from the outset, I think is very important, because even in a case like Vietnam, you can see that their success is very much driven by foreign firms, right? I think it has been a success, the SEZ program, and also beyond just employment in foreign firms, right? And you could look at different indicators that should convince you of that. But still, what is lacking is in many industries that you have. In some, you increasingly have it, but in many industries, it's still the foreign firms that are employing they're doing most of the export-oriented production that are the most productive and so forth. And I think in order to make the next step and to at some point, like, I don't know, for example, if you look at Korea now, like to have your own SK hynix, like that is now the leading memory maker, right? Or like Samsung, of course, Samsung, like, of course, some of these, like, you have a big role of the state and you're back in the discussion on policy, but to have your own local firm, this learning has to take place, right? And I think foreign firms are crucial and probably often even like absolutely necessary early on to get that flywheel spinning. But I think at some point, ideally from the beginning, you have to involve local firms, and all of that. I think a very capable bureaucracy is necessary to get that balance right.
Yeah. I think in China, they required and I know at the beginning, I don't know about now, but they required foreign firms to basically enter into joint ventures with local Chinese firms, right? And then and then I think they required some Chinese, like, it couldn't be a joint venture where like all the Chinese are doing the grunt level work and then it's just like expat managers. I think there had to actually be representation of Chinese managers learning from these expat managers over time, because then they can at some point, once they've learned enough, go spin out their own domestic firm.
Exactly. That's one strategy. Although I'm not sure if this is like a strategy that, because the attraction, like, or why do foreign companies do it? Because they have this huge market that they want to address in China, right? That's why they're willing to form these joint ventures and give up like know-how. And for many African countries, they like the balance may be a bit, or the calculation may be a bit different. So I would hesitate suggesting that specific policy. But I like point taken. This is one approach how to involve, like how to do it.
Yeah, basically high level, you're just saying there should be some sort of thought put into how do we have a forcing function for like local firms to be involved in learning from foreign practices. And if you don't have a super talented or high capacity bureaucracy to enforce these like local regulations that can be tricky to enforce, like that's probably not a great policy. Like, think of another way to enable this learning to take place between domestic firms and foreign firms. I think that's correct. Perfect. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time, Tevin. Thank you so much for this presentation and for the great working paper. As I said, the working paper is linked to in the show notes. It's also on our website, aul.city. That's everything from my side. Again, I'm Curtis Lockhart. I'm founder and executive director of the Africa Urban Lab. If those of you who are listening, if you want to learn more about the AUL's work, as I said, you can check out our website, www.aul.city, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Twitter at Africa Urban Lab. Tevin, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Curtis.
The paper.
It was fun.